Hello and welcome to another episode of Wheelsboy Chat, where we invite an interesting guest to talk about an interesting topic related to the Chinese car market. The guest for today's video is none other than Mr. Mark Andrews, who has been an automotive journalist here in China for almost 15 years. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for calling me an interesting guest.
Oh, you're very welcome. For today's video, well, it seems like we can't help but have British guests on this show, so I'm going to pick a uniquely British-related topic. Mark, what I want to ask you is, do you believe that MG and Maxus are still British brands?
Wow, that is a big question. I don't know if you know this, Ethan. I think you probably do, actually, but I'm sure most of our viewers do not. I started off with the test driving, with doing a test drive of the Rowe 750. That was the very first car I ever test drove in China,
classic.
and that was in
Yes.
2007. And of course, that came from the Rover 75, the whole MG Rover collapse, etc. So I've been following the story for a long time. Is MG and Maxus still British? Well, yes and no.
Yes and no. Should we provide a little bit of context maybe for our audience about why is it we're even asking this question, right? MG is historically one of the most British brands. Everybody thinks of the MG, MGB and MG sports cars and stuff. Maxus isn't, I don't think, known as well outside of the UK, or it wasn't previously.
Yeah, okay.
So they've been purchased by a Chinese company, right?
Yeah. It's a long story, actually, to say the least.
Give us the
So essentially, the British car industry had problems for a long time.
Really?
And you had most of the companies being grouped into something that was at one time called British Leyland, became Austin Rover, MG Rover, various different names. So that was most of the brands. There were some other brands that were separate, that were not involved in this. So around about 2004, the whole MG Rover thing absolutely collapsed. At the time, MG Rover were in talks with SAIC, SAIC in China to try
Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, yes.
Yeah, to try and create a joint venture. And the idea was that SAIC would have 70% ownership, whereas Rover would have 30% ownership. SAIC kind of realized that actually the finances of MG Rover were pretty precarious, to say the least.
It wasn't worth it. It just wasn't worth it.
Precisely. And hey, how about we get the IP and we'll pay you some money for that?
So we don't get dragged down by
you. So they got the IP for the Rover 75, the Rover 25, some engines and some other tech. Now, the joint venture was still meant to go ahead. You got into March 2005, and MG Rover just was basically bankrupt.
Okay.
So SAIC had the IP, but then there was the fire sale that came. And Nanjing Automobiles bought the MG name and all the tooling from the factory.
For the MGs.
For the MG Rover cars.
Right. Which in theory...
So you then had two producers in China producing the Rover 75, one called the Rowe, or it really should be called Rowe 750,
right,
and the other, the MG7, both based on the Rover 75.
This is a long story. You were right. This is as usually is the case with these corporate takeovers and stuff. This gets very complicated.
Yeah. So I think let's fast forward a few years into the future from there. So you had a forced merger between Nanjing and SAIC. And so that brought the two brands together again. The Rover name was not included in the sale. Ford snapped up the Rover name to safeguard Land Rover, Range Rover, which at that time was part of Ford.
Premium vehicle group,
yeah. SAIC thought they were going to have the Rover name, but didn't for some reason. I'm not quite sure how that happened.
Which is how we end up with a car that's called the Rowe, or the Wrong Way is the Chinese name, which is supposed to sound like Rover.
I mean, I always pronounce it Rowe, but it's actually, I believe, meant to be pronounced Rowe. as in sounding much more similar to
Like you were a German?
Rover.
As if a
Yeah,
German
well,
pronounced it.
yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Okay, so with that important context,
Yeah.
you said, when I asked you the question of are MG and Maxus, do you as a British person consider them to be British brands? You said yes and no. So what did you mean by that?
Right. And obviously with MG, there's a huge heritage there.
Right.
But look at what that heritage is and look at the cars being produced today and how they represent that heritage. Now, I would say that the cars being produced today do not really represent that heritage at all, because going back in the past, most MGs, or at least what MG is known for, was two-seater sports cars.
Right. The MGB that I referenced earlier.
Yeah,
things
precisely.
like that. Yeah.
I mean, through history, that was mainly what they were known for. They didn't produce those exclusively. They did actually produce some four-seat, even four-door cars, but it was primarily two-seater, two-door sports cars.
Certainly that's what they're known for in the US, yes.
Yeah. But the MG brand name actually started to be diluted even under British ownership. So they just did rebadged versions of Rover or Austin cars, which they would shove an MG badge on. But there was a clear difference in that MG were always the sporty variant.
Oh, okay.
So they did try to keep some of that heritage. And under Chinese ownership, has not been a clear distinction so far between MG and Rowe. What is the difference between those two brands?
Right.
Can you tell me the difference?
Well, there's essentially a ton of platform sharing across the two brands, right? It's essentially they're the same cars underneath with different badges and styling, right?
Largely, yes.
Largely, yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps a sliver of hope, MG Cyberster.
Yes.
We covered this in our from our coverage of the Shanghai Auto Show, which we'll link to the video above.
Yeah.
We talk about the MG Cyberster, which was a concept that came out, which perhaps should it actually make it to market.
It is making it to market.
It is, yay.
Yeah.
Could be somewhat of a minor renaissance of the MG sports car heritage.
Definitely. I got to speak to the head designer of SAIC at the show, Xiao Jingfeng. And he is actually, I think if he had free reign, he would pretty much be producing sports cars. And I feel he actually really quite understands the heritage of the brand, but I think he's a little bit constrained by upper management to sort of have free reign.
I feel like that applies to most, and I've never met a designer. I've never met a designer that was like, do you know what I grew up dreaming of doing? I grew up dreaming of designing economy cars. I just wanted to design an affordable hatchback. They were like every other kid. They were they were drawing sports cars and stuff. So yes, that makes perfect sense.
And I think also he's trying to take MG into a more sporty direction. Okay, yes, they're still going to be making mainstream cars, and MG is going to be primarily the brand that they'll be using for export. Rowe is not an export brand at all. Although they do just slap on an MG badge on some Rowe models and shove them onto some markets.
Electric ones, specific. I think the electric.
Like the MG5 in Europe is actually the Rowe EI5 in China.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is a very common ride-hailing car here.
Yeah.
Chinese
taxi.
Uber or whatever.
Yeah,
so, talk about Maxus for a minute before we get into, because we've talked a little bit about.
Yeah, we haven't really mentioned Maxus. So, Maxus was never a car producer. Never has been a car producer.
Interesting. I did not know that.
And in fact, Maxus was a range of cars, a range of vans. Sorry, a range of vans.
Ah, so when you say car producer, you mean literal passenger cars?
Yeah, it's never produced passenger cars.
Okay.
It was a producer of trucks and vans. In fact, vans. Just vans, because LDV was created in, I think, 1993.
LDV being, educate me.
It was a company that came from, there was a company prior to that called Leyland DAF, which was a venture between the truck-making division of British Leyland, who I mentioned way back,
I've heard
and DAF in Holland.
Okay,
Netherlands.
yeah, I've heard of DAF
So they
too.
had a joint venture that collapsed.
The British motoring industry, the history of the British motoring industry is the most incestuous and fascinating thing I've ever heard of. It's like the history of royalty.
Yeah.
It's just intermarriage and collapse.
Precisely.
So please, you were saying.
So out of that, Leyland DAF produced both trucks and vans.
Right.
LDV just produced vans.
Okay.
And at the end, they were going to produce, as a JV, a new van range with Daewoo in South Korea.
What a combination of powers.
Yeah, precisely.
a coming together of giants.
Yeah. And that didn't quite take place because Daewoo went into receivership.
Right.
And so LDV got the design from GM because GM weren't interested in doing it.
Right.
And so the last range that they produced of vans was known as the LDV Maxus. So it was a range of vans. It was a range name, not a brand name.
Okay. So it would be like somebody taking the Golf name and saying, like, this is now a car company. The company's name is Golf.
Precisely.
And they make this car, this car, this car, and this
Jetta,
car.
anybody?
Or, oh, wow, whoa. They actually did that. They actually did that here in China because they made a brand. Volkswagen has a sub-brand in China that is literally just called Jetta, which is the name for the sedan, the Jetta sedan. But they're like, hey, let's just make it a whole brand of different cars, which are rebadged, cheaper versions of Volkswagens. So,
well, most of them are actually SAICs.
Okay, never mind. SAICs. So Maxus nowadays, right? They produce. So it's arguable that they were really they never made passenger cars in Great Britain. Nowadays, as far as I think we were talking before, they only sell their cars abroad. When they sell them, they're not passenger vehicles. They're mostly work vehicles.
No,
is that right?
that's not the case. When Maxus started producing in China, initially they did just start producing sort of vans, minibuses, those kind of things. Then they did the G10, which was an MPV.
Right.
Then they suddenly did the D90.
The SUV.
The SUV, the big SUV.
Right.
Which was the first really what you could say car.
Yeah, passenger,
consumer
vehicle.
I would say the G10 was still sort of van-like.
Right.
Because it was quite a large MPV. And then from then on, they started producing smaller SUVs, etc. And so they really became a car producer as well. And that's completely new. They do export, but in some markets, they actually use the LDV name rather than Maxus name. So certainly with Australia, I think Ireland and maybe the UK, they use the LDV name because it's better known there. Then, for example, with the the Maxus pickup in Thailand, that's an MG. Okay. They put an MG badge on
I'm sure there's a reason for that. I'm sure there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Well, what a fascinating history of British motoring that probably only covers 1/1000th of all the insane things that happened, even just in the 80s and 90s. And of course, this is somewhat of a moot point because the idea of a car that belongs to one country is kind of silly in a world of global brands. It's like me arguing about General Motors and saying that, is it an American brand? It's yes, but it's sold all over the world and has headquarters and probably pays taxes in Holland, so it doesn't really matter.
Although, from what I'd say with that is that General Motors does have factories in many different countries, whereas generally the British manufacturers did not.
True,
they did tend to just produce in the UK rather than having factories all over the place.
They were uniquely British in both good and bad ways.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I appreciate the history lesson, and I'm sure our audience does as well. Thank you very much for joining us for this video. Thank you to Mark, of course, for educating us.
Thank you.
And for his opinions. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we hope that you will comment below on some other topics that you would like to hear us talk about related to the Chinese car market. And of course, as always, like, subscribe, and hit the bell. And hey, while you're at it, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Why don't you? Thanks for watching.